Hello and welcome back to another Reacts video. Now this one, I've read the title and it definitely seems like a little bit more controversial. The story of global esports, a global failure. Now I'm not gonna lie, I'm hoping it's a little bit clickbait because the title definitely seems a little bit harsh for a team running out their first time in the VCT. But hey, I guess we'll just have to wait and see what they've said within this video, and hey, I'm gonna get right into it.
The VCT Pacific has always been competitive as it covers a large part of the globe. Teams such as DRX and PaperX have always dominated the international servers consistently, but one team from the Pacific region named Global Esports had a different approach to Valorant. Their team had really stood out from the others. So what was it, and did they succeed? This is the story of Global Esports, the only team which represented Indian Valorant at the main stage. Global Esports, like any other franchise team, had a huge fan base within its own region of India. The team were domestic giants and would very easily make it into the grand finals almost all the time at their local tournaments. But this was no easy task, and thus Global needed that X factor within their team. This X factor would later drive the Indian Valorant scene to the international stage, and his name was SK Rossi, one of the region's most insane duelists. He would later make his name known by his very unique way of using the AWP. This, along with his flashy and aggressive playstyle on Jet, it was simply a treat to watch. SK Rossi, along with his team, which initially consisted of lightning fast,
I love the paint level graphics that we've got going on.
After beating their biggest rivals, Velocity Gaming, in the best of 5. This would then grant them a spot at the APAC LCQ, which was something that this team desperately needed: international exposure. The VCT APAC LCQ was any APAC's team's final chance to get into the 2021 Valorant Champions, and so keeping this in mind, Global would go on to play Damwon Gaming and would eventually beat them by winning split. Global as a team showed up, but SK Rossi had an insane 296 ACS that day. But things wouldn't go the way that they imagined, as their next match would be against PaperX, who would go on to humiliate the Indian team by winning 13-0.
Oh, come on, man. It's coming up against Jing and like Devi.
The fans, although begging
fucking
for
Devi on Jet, fair play,
never thought their team, even at their lowest, would lose that horribly to a PaperX squad who wouldn't even go on to qualify for that year's champion. The team still had the lower bracket for the LCQ, but even in that game, they'd go on to choke their lead to the F4Q roster. Although Rossi would drop 76 kills across all the maps, the team in itself would choke when it came to the opponent's map pick. The team had a bunch of problems, and they'd go on to address this by exposing themselves to other Southeast Asian teams such as Alter Ego and Louvre. Global was still pretty young, and as a roster, with its first international venture outside its known space, it was a hard time for the team. But this never stopped the team, and in 2022, they'd once again find themselves in the Valorant Conquest Championship.
5K, Esperanza.
As Global would go on to lose to Enigma in the semis and Velocity in the finals. But because they were two spots
who
for APAC
should sign. They should
Global
get Bunny.
had by default made it in despite losing to their grand final. Although both the teams would enter the APAC Challengers, Global had only made it into the play-in spot, meaning they would have to qualify for groups and win the knockout stage in order to have a slot at Masters Reykjavik. They were certainly very far from actually achieving anything. Global, as stated before, looked different from last year. The team, often regarded as India's best, along with Velocity, were sure to take down Fancy United and Griffin Esports. But the truth was rather far from that, as Global
makes me
would
think
go
of
on
Family
to lose
Guy
to Griffin as well as Fancy United, which would eventually end their run for Reykjavik.
Griffin?
Later in the same year, Global would qualify for the APAC Stage 2 groups, and unlike previously, Global didn't have to play in the play-ins, as this time they came out as the #1 seed from their region. The winner of the groups would have to play in the APAC playoffs, and by securing the playoff, it means you would have secured a spot for Masters Copenhagen, and that's exactly what Global needed: another chance to prove themselves. With their first match against Alter Ego, Global were confident, as they've already played them before during the off-season. But even that wouldn't help Global, as they'd gone to lose 2-0, and even after swapping Rossi to the already broken chamber at the time, they were once again thrown into the lower bracket, and this time they'd face RRQ.
That's the thing though, it's going to be one of those things where like
RRQ's comeback on the
there's going to be more Indian talent coming up by the fact that they see global esports on a global stage.
This would end Global's international run during 2022. With a few invitationals and local tournaments, we could still see Global playing on the side, but that was it from the global esports we knew. If this was the best Indian Valorant had to offer, then there was certainly a problem if they ever want to venture into the international stages. With Valorant
but it's a young scene.
Having a limited amount of spots, Global had almost no chance of making it in as an org representing APAC, but that would soon change. change, as Riot would announce their final 30 VCT teams, out of which Global was the only Indian org within the APAC region. There was hope. The local scene were happy, as the roster would go forth to decide their new road to champions. Instead of the team playing through APAC
Hey, it's
qualifiers,
big time.
this time they'd have a direct slot to the highest international competition at the start of the year. This was the big break Global was looking for, as chance after chance they failed to prove their worth, so with such an opportunity, Global had to cook up something big. A week later, Global would announce a 10-man roster, out of which they were keen on signing 4 APAC players and 1 player from NA. From the looks of it, people speculated that Global were going in for a mixed team, and with their name being obviously Global Esports, it's no surprise that they went
That's
all
the thing,
out.
they
intended
definitely
on
had
signing
one
an
of the
NA
like
player, and that player was none other than XZ Aaron,
one of the
who really
coolest
showed us
sort of
how
like
far he could bring
roster
XZ
rumors
to champions after dominating
because
in NA
like
for a while.
every
During
other
the same
team,
month,
I don't think there was
Global would then
anything that
bring
was
in their
that
APAC
crazy.
players,
Like
who
obviously
were
Liquid
Texture
roster was
and
cool,
Bazi from
Artist
South
going was
Korea,
cool,
and
but we
Vronsky
kind of
from
knew
the
all that
Oceanic
stuff.
region, and
But this
Maniet
was the
from
most unique
Indonesia.
roster.
These players were no random pickups, and Global really knew what they were doing here. But what about the Indian players? After all, this is an Indian org, so where were they? Even
They knew
though
what
it
they were
must have
doing.
been a
They
difficult
picked up
decision
like
for Global, they
5
placed
jet
SK
mains.
Rossi and Lightning Fast on the active roster. Things were moving fast, and as Valorant loves to start early in the year, the VCT lock-in was soon to commence. In all fairness, a lot of teams had new players, and China as a region was invited, so it was reasonable to assume that this tournament was going to bring in chaos. Things soon kicked off in Sao Paulo, and Global's first game was against Team Vitality. This was Global's first time together as a newly formed team, the best talents from across the globe
it's my
put
boy
together in a
Twistin.
team. So with so many stacked players, things ought to go in Global's way, right? At least for the first match. But unfortunately, this was not the case.
To be honest, that
Twistin,
Vitality
rest in
team
peace,
was
the
decent.
jet of Vitality, and he
Like,
simply
it's-
tore apart the team at their own
I
map.
think that
Global
was a
couldn't find
hard
an
game to
answer,
go
and
into as
although
your
SK
first
Rossi
as like
would show
a
up on the
5
second
core
map,
with like
things wouldn't end
multiple
well in the last
players
map for
from
Global.
different cultures and
Twistin,
stuff.
at least for me, will always be remembered for his dominance in that specific game. He ended the game with
Twistin was
284
unreal in that
ACS,
match.
but something to note was that Rossi, who mainly played Jet and Chamber, played agents such as Sova, Killjoy, and Sage during lock-in. Another thing to note was that this was a single elimination tournament, so not much
Yeah.
was expected from many teams.
I still
as many
remember
stories are
speaking to
definitely
like
made
Big
in the
Time
lower
and him just
brackets.
saying
The
about
team
like
had quite a bit to
the
look
work
forward to,
ethic
as they'd
of
gone
like
to participate
players
in the
like
VCT
Rossi and
Pacific
how much he's
alongside
willing to
teams
learn
such as
and
DRX
adapt. So
and PaperX. So
I
the bar
hope they
was really
keep him. I
high
hope
for
he
the
sticks
APAC
around,
teams,
even
and
if he's
Global
not
could
like the
still
jet
prove their
main.
worth within this APAC tournament.
I'd love to
The
see him
VCT
adapt into
Pacific
something
was a
else.
LAN tournament, meaning all the teams had to fly into Seoul, where the event took place. Global had to set up their Korean boot camp and were ready to practice together, unlike any other team in that region. But they still had one problem. Because of external issues, Global were not able to fly over the 2 Indian players to Seoul. But as mentioned before, the team was stacked with players, so their substitute was Vronsky, an oceanic beast, who even till this day never really got his time to shine in the team. But that certainly wasn't the case for the other players. And by other players, I specifically mean Maniet.
Maniet is the fucking GOAT.
Such as T1,
They
DRX,
better
and
have him in
Zeta,
like
they
the
made it very
longest
close,
fucking contract known
especially
to
with their
man.
game against DRX.
Well, actually,
The
or
game
not
was so
if he's
tight
gonna go
between the
somewhere
two,
else.
and
But like
because DRX was a giant
kid's
in
too
the
good.
Pacific
The
region,
kid is
it made
too
people
good.
kind of respect Global's attempt in this tournament.
If
Although
he
the
doesn't
Augs
win a
face
championship
SK
one
Rossi
day,
wasn't
I'm gonna be
there,
disappointed.
These guys certainly had their back, even though they lost all the 3 games. Eventually, Rossi and Lightning Fast would join the current roster for their next game and would play against Talon in a pretty convincing
Hey, it's me!
fashion by beating them 2-1. Things were
What the
moving fast,
did-
and Global were set on to
I'm
face
now
Paper
reacting
Rex,
to
who, if
someone
you
reacting
already
to me.
didn't know, were kind of Global's arch
Oh
nemesis,
no,
at
I've
least
hit
in
some
APAC.
like
They had
weird
lost to Paper
meta
Rex twice.
thing. I don't know,
People
my
really
cam
didn't
actually
have
might
high
have been
hopes for
covering
this
that, I'm not
match,
sure.
and they were right, as Global would go on to have a good start, but would eventually feed on to Paper Rex's something on Pro. Things didn't go well, and Global would eventually lose to Paper Rex on the deciding map. And although Rossi played a little better this time, it was definitely more to do with the issues regarding Global as a whole team. Their next game would be against Genji, who had a decent start at the tournament, but for some reason were lacking as time went on. Global's best game
True.
till this
Yeah,
day
Genji
is
definitely
probably
fell
against
off.
Genji. Not because SK Rossi was insane that day, maybe, but because the team looked, well, more like a structured team.
To be
But
honest,
unfortunately,
SK Rossi,
even after
this was
win
probably,
against Genji,
I think this
they
was
would
his
lose
best
their match
series.
against
Like he
Team
played
Secret,
unreal.
which
Like he
really
was
mattered
playing
to
as a
Global,
pure entry
as it
for
would
most of it as
decide
well.
whether they play or not. Global's run was almost over up until the LCQ was announced for the Pacific region. Teams such as Zeta Division and RRQ were all present in the Pacific LCQ.
I'm
Global
so
had
done
no
with
excuses. They had the
LCQs.
time to prepare with the whole team, and this time Rossi and Lightning
to be fair,
Fast
I think
were
they're gone
present to
now,
add to
so
the team's strength.
you got
If
what you
things were
wanted.
looking bad for Global, it would only really ever get worse, as they would once again go on to lose against RRQ in the LCQ. This was it for for Global Esports. Their Champion 2023 run had ended after this loss against RRQ. Other than the VCT lock-in, we never really saw Global's international presence. Maybe we did, but not the real international presence that we were looking for. Some highlights of the team were Global's pistol rounds, which had an unreasonably high win rate, and their smoke
their pistol rounds are actually insane.
Very casually smurfs against other teams, which in turn gives Global a round or two. SK Rossi, the face of Indian Valorant, once again steps down from a year's run. His inconsistency is kinda holding him back, but the amount of pressure the team receives is also another thing to note. Esports is kind of an ever-changing scene, which means sometimes you're blessed with a certain player or cursed enough to never make a good run ever again. Global's chapter may have ended this year on a rough note, but the team's willingness to strive and the dedication to improve on the local scene still gives us and me hope to believe that there's something more coming from this roster or this team. But for now, we just have to wait. I'm Busty, and thank you for watching this video. Peace.
So he did bait the shit out of us with the title. Okay, Busty. Okay, I see you. I like the video. I think most of what was said was true. I think, like, I don't think it's necessarily the, like, a global failure or the end of the world. They had a lot of problems early on in the season, and honestly, if they had Rossi earlier, if they had the full roster earlier, maybe they make it out into the playoffs and we see a different story for them. So I'm definitely, they're one of the teams I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on most in terms of, like, my expectations. But ultimately, I hope that we still see that same roster, or at least, like, bits of it. I think, like, Monya, I'd love to still see Rossi on the stage, but either way, let me know what you guys think. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. I've been Tombizz. I'll see you next time.